Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that hopes our comeback is better than Liz Truss's. And how are you, Rob?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. Very good. Just come back off a little break, as I said. And yeah, all up for this podcast. I feel like there's been a little bit happening in the past month.
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely stuff going on. I don't think we're going to talk about everything that I would want to talk about in this episode, but we've got some important stuff to talk about in the headlines, which we'll get onto in a second. As Rob alluded to just there, don't forget, if you check us out on Patreon, we do a little bonus episode where you can hear us just chatting about life and other stuff that interests us. Rob has just been on holiday. I'm off on holiday soon. What such joys that you could listen to if you throw $1 a month our way. Or more. You can always throw more our way. Always good. But yeah, I guess we should head on into the headlines. So, I mean, breaking news as suddenly... This is probably the first time in a while where I feel the breaking news has been warranted. on the BBC, because like when the Queen passed away, we'd kind of all worked it out by the time it happened. But I do agree that it was breaking news, right? That was an important thing. And there's been a few other things, Liz Truss, which we touched on. But really, breaking news gets used an awful lot for stuff that isn't at all breaking. Today, breaking news alert on the phone: Nicola Sturgeon is resigning, and I think that kind of came out of the blue to a lot of people. So, do you want to talk a bit about that, Rob?
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, I want to phrase this by saying I'm no expert on Scottish politics, but I think it was a surprise to everybody that Nicola Sturgeon, one of the most successful SNP leaders of our time, came into power in 2014, led the charge for a referendum, and on the back of that lost referendum, actually that sort of strengthened the SNP's hold on the rest of Scotland, and they've been incredibly successful in taking control in Scottish Parliament, which uses a voting system that pretty much should guarantee some form of coalition. And under her leadership, it hasn't. The SNP have been the majority party. They are that popular in Scotland. And although she's been seen as quite a divisive figure, clearly if you are, pro-Scottish independence, you're going to be for it. And if you're against, you're going to be very much against her and everything she stands for. I think it was quite a shock to the outsider that she decided at this point to stand down. Because, well, if you compare it, I was making the comparisons in my head as I was watching her resignation speech to a lot of, other resignation speeches that we've seen earlier. If you think of Boris Johnson, for example, he resigned only when the writing was well and truly on the wall and nobody would be in a cabinet anymore. He was forced to resign, but he hung on by his fingernails before he finally went. Liz Truss, again, another person who was forced to resign basically because her party kicked her out. There were very few signs that, even if Nicola Sturgeon was reaching a stage where her party was starting to lose trust with her, it hadn't become critical yet. So I think this was her chance to sort of take the narrative on this, like take the lead and say, no, I'm going to leave on my terms and do it my way. And I don't know if you got a chance to listen to any of her speech, but I thought it was quite impressive what she had to say.
Yeah, no, I watched the speech in full. I think there was a slight delay. I did that thing where you accidentally hit pause on the BBC iPlayer app because I kind of had it on in the background while I was running some tests at work. But yeah, no, I think it was very well handled, and she stayed around for questions at the end. And I think a lot of, as you say, I'm also not an expert on Scottish politics, but I've been in a few conversations today with some Scottish people who have done a good job, I think, of putting up with all the English people in the chat, comparing it too much to Westminster, and also just kind of explaining, a few things. But yeah, I think in summary, it was a really good speech. Quite a few of us posted a link to the Hamilton song. We'll show them how to let go, which is all about when George Washington, after 2 terms went, okay, that's it. I'm going to write a letter and be like, I'm quitting and here's why. Also references to Jacinda Ardern, who recently stepped down in New Zealand. And I think it's nice to be reminded that you can have a leader in the UK who can just be like, my time's up for whatever reason. And it's, people have been like, oh, there's stuff on the horizon for it. But, she was still doing well in the polls. She was still generally well liked. And saying, as she said in her speech, essentially, look, I'm 53 and I want to have some time to myself. Like you don't have that time to yourself when you are in charge of a country. You're so busy doing stuff. And she took the country through everything with COVID, where I think we generally were quite, we talked about it a bit, the differences between the various countries in the UK at the time. And Scotland generally seemed to handle it a lot better, I would say overall. And I think, when you've come through something stressful like that, it's get your party into a position where you feel you can hand over to someone else. And I think it's a little way away from their next, like, they've fairly recently had an election, right? So it's a good time to pass on so that whoever takes over has the chance to get the momentum behind them when they next have an election. And they're also 2 years out from a UK general election, because obviously that's the confusing thing. You have people who go to Westminster, and also you have MSPs who go to Holyrood. So it's like a confusing that there's two systems going on doing two different things. But yeah, I think generally it just shows that there's a different type of politics in Scotland, and you can't really compare it to Westminster at all, because it does just seem much more laid back's the wrong term, but it's there's a lot less of this kind of horrible backstabbing and stuff. It seems like they're just going to have a nice, sensible process to elect a replacement for her, and then she will step down. And kind of makes you miss the time when leaders did that. Have they ever done that in England? I'm not really sure we've ever had that luxury, not for a long time.
If you think of the the transfer of power from Blair to Brown, that's the only thing. And it, like you said earlier, if you're talking to Scottish people, it is wrong of us to compare it to the Westminster model. But the only one that came to mind in my time was Blair could see the writing was on the wall that he was slowly losing popularity, so had to hand it over to the man who, and it was always, unlike Nicola Sturgeon when she resigned, nobody quite knows who the next leader is going to be. When Blair resigned, everybody sort of pointed at Gordon Brown and said, well, he's the only man for the job. That was somebody who just fairly recently won an election, was halfway through his term and said, I know I'm not going to make it to the end of this one. It's time for me to step aside. And he did it on his terms, because I think everybody else has sort of been, all the other Conservative leaders that have had to leave us. Cameron was forced out because he lost his main policy on Brexit. May couldn't keep control of the parliamentary party. Boris couldn't keep control of the parliamentary party, and Liz Truss couldn't keep control of the parliamentary party. So maybe in the SNP there are these huge factions and divides that I don't know about, but it doesn't appear that way from the outside. And I think to the layperson, you can see those fractions in the Conservative Party. There was one interesting thing that she pointed on that I'd just like to raise. She was talking how there are issues about wider politics, and saying this has leaked into stuff that's happened in both Westminster and across the world, where you have these issues that you want debated, but because she's the person in charge, and she's been in charge for nearly 10 years now, the SNP, everything is framed through, well, Nicola Sturgeon wants this policy, therefore, if you're anti-Nicola Sturgeon and maybe anti-independence, then you must be against it. And although she didn't say that it was about short-term factors, one policy that has been catching the headlines around the country at the moment is the self-recognition bill in Scotland, where they can say that people can self-identify as the gender that they want to. And I think Nicola Sturgeon is right in kind of framing it as, just because I believe in self-recognition for gender doesn't mean that you have to have your view on Scottish independence and me affect your view of that. Do you get what I mean? Those two issues are entirely morally separate and divided, and you shouldn't have to put it through the lens of what one person thinks about both of them. But we have, as a society, become quite obsessed with personality-driven politics and saying, hey, that's, hey, I really like Boris Johnson, therefore I'll like everything that Boris Johnson says. It's kind of silly in a way. You don't have to share all the same morals as Boris Johnson, and Nicola Sturgeon is saying that your view on Scottish independence shouldn't actually affect your view on self-gender recognition, but she felt she was being dragged into the debate, and the debate was being run on those lines. So it was a good idea for her to step aside, or maybe that we don't get so obsessed with leaders, so we can have a more fruitful type of debate in the future. And that's something I largely agree with. I think the quality of debate in this country would be better if we focus on sort of issues as they stand independently, rather than thinking of them through the lens of a leader. But yeah, if that will actually come to fruition, that's she herself said it was quite an optimistic worldview, and I'm not quite sure it will happen. But yeah, it's a nice thought at least, and it really made me think about how politics could be improved.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. There is this kind of, oh, well, this person likes this, or I think this person would like this. And you don't have to tie everything into it. I mean, we've kind of touched on it. I think we've mentioned before with this, with the gender recognition certificates, that it's gone to Westminster, and Westminster's essentially gone, no, we're blocking it under this thing, which doesn't really make sense, because they're kind of like, they can frame it as kind of like we're stopping. There's this whole like, we, the government, think, me speaking as the government here, this is weird. Sorry, let me carry on.
That's all right.
It was like, so the government have essentially gone and said, the government thinks because of something to do with the Equality Act, you can't do this. It's not one of your devolved powers, even though, and then that's gone off to the Supreme Court, and obviously it got knocked down because of course it did when it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's English. That's not surprising at all. But like, then as you say, everyone's saying, oh, well, this is something to do with independence. It's like, they're completely different issues, and we shouldn't be like framing this around an independence thing. And they've pulled in all this, I think the Conservatives have gone and pulled in a whole unnecessary amount of baggage into, like, they essentially wanted to stop this legislation in line with Tory values, which I don't agree with, but it's not surprising that they tried to stop it. But then they've kind of gone, oh, it's something to do with independence. But no, you're supposed to, like, the Conservatives are always saying they're in charge. They're in charge. I mean, the Conservatives are always saying they want to look after the union, and then they, like, in order to get some petty culture war points, are blocking a thing. And I know there's more to it than that, and I don't think we're going in depth on any of that today, but like, there's a lot going on there around that. And it's like, these things should be separate issues, as you say. One other thing I just want to touch on while we're talking about Nicola Sturgeon is there's a poll that went out last week. I've put the tweet of who should succeed Nicola Sturgeon, a poll of the Scottish public. And obviously this was before she said she was going to step down. So 69% said don't know, which, I guess is not surprising. As you say, like, she's been there for a long time. People probably thought she was going to continue to be there for a long time, so hadn't yet made their mind up. But it is kind of telling that there's a group of 7 names in this list, of which I've heard of a few for various reasons, but I haven't heard of all of them. I'm sure there will be more recognisable to Scottish listeners, but the percentages between, there's not much. There's one guy on 1%, but most of them, we're talking like, it's between 2 and 7% for these people. And it's because, when she's been there that long, there isn't, because she hasn't had some massive, I mean, there have been scandals and stuff. There's an investigation into how the SNP have spent money and all sorts going on. But there's not been like, it's not like been with Boris or other people where we've been like, oh, well, they're definitely good. They've got to fall over tomorrow, right? Like, and it may have taken longer than we expected with Boris to get out, but we already kind of knew who the contenders were because we expected him to go soon. And this is kind of the polar opposite, where there are a number of people who probably could come forwards, and I'm sure there are some others who aren't on that list who've been polled for who'll probably throw their hat in the ring at some point. But we just, no one really has a strong feeling about it because we didn't expect her to step down. So, interesting. And I guess after we predicted last time that there won't be much for us to talk about in Scotland this year, we've been immediately proven wrong. So that's great. It'll be interesting to see what happens. So moving on, next headline. Labour and the European Court of Human Rights. There was this anti-Semitism row that kind of came up under Corbyn, and then there's been an investigation, and Labour said they'd have to do better. And there's been, I think there was a report as well. The usual kind of stuff that kind of kicks this story down the road for 3 or 4 years from when it actually happened. And I guess what has been the fallout from that? And will Corbyn run at the next general election, do we think?
Yeah, so this is the story that sort of Labour are officially drawing a line under that anti-Semitism row. And one of the things that's come out of it, quite interestingly, is that Starmer has officially said that Jeremy Corbyn won't be running for Labour at the next election. Jeremy Corbyn has been questioned if he will stand as an independent and is yet to comment. I think it sort of shows it's important to see where the parties are at this stage. If you think where Jeremy Corbyn was about sort of 5 years ago, that 2017 election, he was riding on the crest of a wave. Like, he'd suddenly got power in the Labour Party through a huge grassroots movement. He had momentum, and he had a group behind him called Momentum that were driving the policy of the Labour Party. And for a while, particularly after that election, not victory, but he was able to stop Theresa May getting a majority in that 2017 election. It seemed that his politics would be the one that would dominate the party for years. Now he finds himself not even a part of it. And the fact that Keir Starmer feels confident enough to do that kind of shows that, in my opinion, Labour are really sort of battening down the hatches, saying, yes, we are a united party. If you're not part of, if you don't believe what I believe, get out the party. We don't want you. We believe that we can win the next election without you, which probably is in stark contrast to the fractions and divisions that we're seeing in the Conservative Party now, where they're having to make sort of concessions to each corner of the party just to keep some sort of election coalition together so they can stumble forward into 2014. I think it's an important moment and shows really how far the party has come, how it has taken itself away from Corbynism. And I don't think Keir Starmer could have done that without the results of the 2019 election. Like, nobody heard of Jeremy Corbyn before in 2017. His manifesto was more popular than everybody thought. So what Boris Johnson did in 2019 is he sort of cherry-picked a couple of things off Jeremy Corbyn's wish list. Essentially, Theresa May said, we're doing austerity again, we're giving you nothing. And Jeremy Corbyn was like, no, we're going to spend, we're going to give you things. Boris Johnson kind of stole his cake at the 2019 election and said, no, we'll give you stuff as well. And Corbynism kind of collapsed, and that's how you got the big 70-seat majority for Boris Johnson. So yeah, only on the back of that, I think, can Keir Starmer feel confident enough to sort of kick Corbynism to one side and say, no, we don't need you. No, I'm ahead by 10 points in the polls. You are, quite crucially for Keir Starmer, the Corbyn wing of the party is very small. It was a fact that he struggled to get the MP nominations back when he was running for Labour leader, and he actually had to borrow some from some people who just thought, oh, we'll lend him a couple of votes just to make sure he gets across the line. So we have a bit of debate with the left wing. We defeat them and moved on. That turned to be a big mistake for the MPs within the Labour Party, because they were all of a sudden stuck with a leader that they didn't necessarily agree with all of his principles. They're in a position where they can just move them to one side and say, no, if you're not going to agree with the outcome of this anti-Semitism row, you're out of the Labour Party. We're moving on from this. And it makes a clear distinction between the two. One thing that Rishi Sunak constantly brings up in PMQs, and you hear it over and over again, bizarrely, it's Keir Starmer supported Jeremy Corbyn, that's why you shouldn't vote for Labour. They see it as, clearly, they want to evoke the memory of Jeremy Corbyn in people's mind to remind them why you shouldn't vote Labour. Keir Starmer is trying to put the biggest difference between the two possible, and the biggest difference is chuck him out of the party altogether and not let him back in. It's hard to be seen as a Jeremy Corbyn lover if you're not even letting him in your party. So, yeah, important development there, worth mentioning. And yeah, just sort of as we're going through the headlines and we're kind of touching on each party, I think it is important just to check in with Labour once in a while. I realise I spend a lot of my time moaning about the Conservatives on this podcast, so why not put a bit of spotlight on Labour as well? Yeah, no, I mean, I understand why we're doing that. I think, as you say, it is very interesting, because we thought we were kind of getting into a very left versus very right kind of like echoing American politics. Like, people have called Boris Johnson, Britain, Trump, all of these things are not necessarily good comparisons that they're used to try and simplify concepts that or realities that are much more complex, a bit like we were saying during the discussion on Scotland, where people from outside often simplify things into the model they understand. But it is interesting that, in less than 5 years, we've kind of gone from like, Corbyn's going to have his go and he'll probably win on this quite left-wing, radical for the UK, at least, agenda. And suddenly, like, it seems like that's all kind of deflated. Like, there are still those people, momentum still exists, but they don't have the reins of the party anymore. And I think, it's like when Labour came in with the landslide, right, under Blair, they adopted a more central position. They were obviously more left than the Conservatives, but they were kind of just left of centre, really. And then they said, oh, we're not the Tories are the party of sleaze. And it seems like we're very much setting ourselves up at the moment now for a repeat of 97 in, when will the next one be? 2024. So, yeah, it very much seems like similar lines are being drawn. I'm not sure Keir has the kind of, the je ne sais quoi kind of factor that
Blair had, when Blair was new and up and coming and interesting and had changed the party. But it does seem like, once again, history is repeating itself about 20 years or 25 years on. So, yeah, I don't have much else to add. It just, draw parallels with 97. And, I guess Labour will be, we're at that position where anything is better than what the Conservative Party are doing for the country. And so people will vote for Labour regardless, because we're essentially in a two-party system. So I guess, can they keep that lead into a general election, as we've discussed at length in our predictions episode? So moving on, our next headline, what's that up in the sky? Something floating over the Midwest of America. What story am I alluding to, Rob, with this?
Yeah, it is the Chinese spy balloon scandal that it started off small and I feel like it suddenly escalated out of nowhere. So essentially what was happening was President Biden was due to host the Chinese premiere over in America, and just before those events, a balloon was spotted flying very low over parts of America, and eventually it was shot down. The premise is that this is some sort of Chinese surveillance and that they are using weather balloons as a way of disguising their surveillance. Essentially, there are loads more weather balloons than I thought that are up in the sky, and mostly they're very hard. If you wanted to sneak your own spy satellite, your spy balloon in there with them, it's relatively easy because not many people sort of monitor the movements. There are so many that it's not like jets where there's some sort of, you can go online, you can monitor every jet or every plane in the world and where it's going. You simply don't track them in the same way. And after this first one was shot down, I think we've had like 5 or 6 others, and it led to a conference with Joe Biden saying that we're not quite sure how some of these are staying up in the air, and we would classify them as unidentified flying objects or UFOs, which got people on a whole "oh my god, it's aliens" tangent, which I think it's unfair. Just because they're unidentified flying objects doesn't immediately mean that they are extraterrestrial in nature, just that we don't quite understand what they are or how they float. It might be some sort of new technology that's going on. But it's essentially where you've got a place where tensions between the US and China are already quite high. There are questions over the support that America gives Japan and control over the South China Sea. There are tensions over Hong Kong and, is democracy being repressed in there? This just sort of adds to it. And what some people thought might be a Chinese power play, having a balloon deliberately in plain sight saying, hey, we're watching you, and might have been a bit of saber rattling to America. America seemed to have taken on the challenge and said, yeah, we'll just, if we see these balloons and think they're yours, we'll shoot them down. So yeah, it's not exactly it's nothing too serious quite yet, but it's quite a weird and a weird diplomatic scandal that will certainly stick in the memory to see how this will affect diplomatic relations going forward between the two nations.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. It's an interesting story, but like you say, I think there was a full-on bit where people were just like going, aliens. You can imagine me doing the hands from the meme right now. And as you say, the key word there is unidentified. I mean, it means we don't know what it is. That could be anything. I know that there was a period where everyone thought that was aliens and stuff, but yeah, I mean, nearly all UFO sightings have been basically ruled down to being like either a weird trick of the light or some kind of spy plane that hadn't been announced. So yeah, it is interesting. I think one thing that you maybe didn't mention is that this first one was kind of powered, right? It's there's different types of balloon, and the first one was definitely something where, while they may not have full control over where it goes, it had its own power system, so it could like kind of move around a bit. And then the other ones that have been shot down, as far as we know, are kind of like more like your traditional balloons and maybe just in the wrong place. Like I think I'm right in saying that every day, the Met Office sends up a weather balloon, like literally every day, and that's how we get some of our really useful weather data. Stuff like are we going to get this much pollen, that kind of stuff. I don't know specifically what the sensors are, but I think I was surprised to find out fairly recently that there's literally a weather balloon going up every day. They go up high enough and then they kind of pop and they fall down somewhere, and parts of it I think can be reclaimed and reused, but they normally need a new balloon. So yeah, there are a lot of these about, and I guess if you're on edge and you have a load of fighter jets, you might just make sure you shoot down one, like, because they're probably not, your own balloons if they're flying into airspace from somewhere else. But also the chances that all of these balloons that have been shot down in the last how many days are all going to be spy balloons, I think is unlikely based on what people are saying. People are saying, it's quite common for their balloons to go off course and people to lose track of them. So probably less of a big deal. But yeah, it did seem like everyone was suddenly like very heads up about it. And of course, in the news, people are like, oh, another one's been shot, another. And it's more that people weren't bothering before than it is, World War III, which is, of course, how I'm sure someone on a right-wing US television network has painted it. But yeah, I guess that's kind of our fun story from the US this week, in a way. I guess that's all our headlines. So on into our main story tonight. So we have a new Prime Minister, as we've discussed, Rishi Sunak. He's been there for just over 100 days now. So how do we think he's done? Well, I mean, I guess first up, what did he say he'd achieved? There's generally quite a big thing. We do this with the presidents. What have they achieved in the first 100 days? All that kind of stuff. People focus on it a bit. And famously, Liz Truss didn't get to 100 days. So this is our first kind of chance since the whole switch over from Johnson to actually look at what someone has managed to achieve. So what did he say he was going to do and what's he done?
Yeah, so I think in the case of Rishi Sunak, we've had it a fair bit since the Conservatives have come to power, where we've had a leader come in and there hasn't been a general election when they've come in. So they have to sort of set out their manifesto, but they haven't been elected on these pledges. And in Rishi Sunak's case, I mean, you remember he's the man who lost a Conservative internal election against Liz Truss, a quite protracted one over last summer. So he did lay out some of his policies then. Those policies have changed or adjusted since he's become Prime Minister. And of course, he didn't even have to face a leadership contest within the Conservative Party because nobody else met the required threshold or chose to stand, if you believe what Boris Johnson says about how many nominations he could have got. So he has laid out his 5 key principles or his 5 priorities of what he wants to do. He wants to halve inflation, reduce government debt, grow the economy, cut waiting lists, and stop small boats. Quite the targets.
Quite the list.
Yeah.
So I guess, do we want to go through each of those in order, as we usually do? Halving inflation. I mean, I think we've already touched on the fact, before we get into this, I'm just going to mention again that halving inflation, still means prices are going up because you're halving the rate of inflation. It's not the same thing as halving prices. So I feel like I have to mention that every single time we talk about this story, because math's hard. But yeah, so how is inflation doing? I know that things still feel like they've got more expensive. I definitely have had my first electricity and gas bill since moving, and yeah, that was expensive. So where are we?
So official statistics say that it is falling, but falling slowly. So it's down from a figure of about 10.5% that was in December to about 10.1%. But as you can see, that is a long way from being halved. And if you're saying that you're feeling the pinch, there were some news stories that broke today that McDonald's has had to put up the price of some things on its menu, which is, for a multinational corporation that kind of prides itself on having the £1 menu, or like reliably, our Big Mac is always £5. That's our staple. That's why people come here. For them to put their prices up a bit clearly shows that inflation is having an effect all over the world, but particularly in the UK. So yes, it's a lofty goal. Most people think that if the war in Ukraine dies down, or that markets slowly adjust to what has happened in Ukraine and find alternative ways to get energy, gas, grain, things that were coming out of Ukraine as well, the inflation will naturally go down. So this target he set himself might be something that happens independently of the government's economic policy. But currently, I mean, it would have been very tough for him to halve inflation within 100 days, and at the moment it is going down slowly. Is that a target he can reach by the 2024 election? At the moment, I doubt it. It seems like he's got a very uphill struggle.
And I think we touched on this last time we spoke about this as well. But like you just said, it's not something that is really within his... There are some levers he can pull on as Prime Minister, and the Chancellor can do some on his behalf. But like it's like judging presidents by how well they did economically. People tend to vote for, if in the US, if a president has been in charge when the economy has been doing well, they tend to get voted in again. And then if the economy does poorly, they tend to vote in the alternative candidate. But also, it's nothing to do with the president. Like, so it's similar to, for our American listeners, kind of similar to over there, you have the Federal Reserve changing interest rates. We have the Bank of England that does the interest rate. So, and they will react based on factors that the government does not control. The government can try and talk to them and say, look, if we do this, this, and this, will that help? And then try and change things a bit. But it's not the same as like halving it or doing anything radical. There are too many external factors, and we've touched on this before, that, after Brexit, COVID and other things, after Brexit specifically, we have, by not being part of Europe, we're now much more susceptible to a hard knock economically. And that's why we've had so many problems recently, worse than everyone else in the G. Was it the G7 results that came out recently?
Yes, yeah, that we are.
I think, or was it G20? We're the slowest recovering, worst performing economy in the G20. I think it was. If it wasn't the G20, it was the G7.
It was the G7 because that's in point number 3. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, okay. We haven't got there yet. Cool. Well, there you go. Corrected already. But yes, we were the slowest growing economy in the G7, which, and people were pointing to, there's one thing we've done that the others haven't, which is Brexit. So, yeah, not much more to add other than, it doesn't seem particularly achievable, as I think we've said several times before and have just repeated. So, number 2, reducing government debt. The main solution we know to this is tax people more. Not necessarily a winning strategy in a cost of living crisis, is it?
No, and it's not necessarily a winning strategy amongst his own party as well. If you remember, there were many reasons why some people rebelled against Boris. Some of them rebelling against Boris because they felt he was being too subservient to Rishi Sunak's economic policy when he was Chancellor, saying we have to tax our way out. Now, the government does have a lot of debt because of the money it had to spend through COVID, through furlough schemes, etc. I think every major economy in the world took a hit to their public purse to get through COVID and lockdowns and what that meant for the impact on their various economies. Even if they didn't lock down, they still had an impact on economies. So you can't quite pin it all on that. But yeah, the government now wants to recover. They want to get some of that money back. One of the main ways you do that is through tax, and that's certainly what his current Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, has stepped up and said that's what we're going to have to do. And already we've seen that the Conservatives have raised taxes to their highest level since post-war to try and get some of that money back. So, yeah, that is, I think, taken on its own, that statement, reduce government debt, sounds entirely sensible. I mean, of course it does. I don't think any sane leader would come out and say my policy is to increase government debt. That sounds terrible. But the way he has to do that, I think, will be unpopular amongst his own party and, as you said, in the cost of living crisis, potentially quite unpopular with the general populace as well. So, yeah, he might be setting himself up for a fail, or maybe hiding the economic levers he has to pull to try and reduce government debt within that.
I'm not going to have much to say on any of these, I don't think. I'm just going to be asking the questions today.
No, that's okay.
I don't think there's much more I can draw on, really, other than to mention, might throw in an aside here and there. But really, yeah, I think there's a lot of this that's going to be kind of tricky. So on a similar theme, number 3, growing the economy. So we've already touched on the G7 results, but so I guess I've kind of spoiled that for you there. But what's going on with growing the economy? Has he achieved anything in that? I mean, in 100 days feels like quite a hard thing to do, but do we know where his policies might lie?
And I think these are things that he wants to sort of like make sure his targets not only over 100 days, but at least set the scene to say how we're going to grow the economy. Once again, I pick up on the point that if anybody led on the phrase, I want to reduce the economy, that would be mad. So I kind of think this statement is a little redundant. It's not controversial either way. But anyway, as we know, his predecessor, Liz Truss, went big on this message of we've got to go for growth. Our economy is stagnant. This is how we do it. And her policy was the exact opposite of Rishi Sunak's, which was let's reduce tax and hope that businesses come here. And we increase productivity. We increase the amount that they make, and therefore that we make more money even if we reduce tax on them because we are encouraging growth. Rishi Sunak hasn't quite laid out how he wants to grow the economy in the same way. And as you pointed out, the fact that we are pretty stagnant at the moment and the only country in the G7 not to recover its output since COVID. So during COVID lockdowns and, the effects of that, production was reduced as there was less demand for things because people are in their houses, etc., not going anywhere. Now things are going back to normal. All other countries in the G7 have started to see that production go up. We are failing to recover. There are many factors on that. I think I saw one of them the other day, which was like, during COVID, a lot of people in their 50s or 60s who could have worked up to retirement age were made redundant because of COVID. They've worked in the tourism industry or something that was affected by it. They said, oh, I've got enough money in the bank, actually, that I don't have to work again. You know what? I think I'm done. And those people have failed to return to the workforce, which means you can't get the bodies in to do the jobs you need. If there's one problem that our economy doesn't have at the moment, it is actually employment. Conservatives rail on about employment and say that we've got some of the highest employment rates in the world. Fantastic. But it's not enough. We need more people employed to get our production up. And there are ways you can do that. One is having more old people in your workforce. One is migration, allowing people to easily migrate from, I don't know, countries across the sea, Europe maybe. Make it easy for them to fill in gaps in the job market. Clearly, that's not as easy as it was. And that is maybe one of the reasons that people are pointing towards our unique economic circumstances being affected by Brexit, and we're starting to see the long tail of that. Of course, there's, as we always say, the caveat on that is it's very hard to specifically say that one thing is caused by Brexit, and you can argue till the cows come home where exactly, the reasons why the UK isn't performing. If you looked at Liz Truss's reasons, she'd say it's because we're naturally lazy and we should be more productive as a country. That was one of the things that she said in her book. So, yeah, lots of reasons there. Essentially, very hard to achieve in 100 days. And I think he hasn't quite got the same go for growth, hell for leather approach that Liz Truss had. And to be honest, I'm grateful for that, considering the impact that she had on the economy. But yeah, there certainly seem to be no quick solutions to the economic stagnation that's happening in the UK at the moment.
Yeah. Again, I'm essentially just going to be agreeing with you in all of these points, it would seem. But yeah, I mean, I think just one point, and I know you said people will argue about it until the cows come home, but on those economic points, the other G7 countries have also had COVID and other things. The key difference, I would think, is that we have broken up from a big group of nations we were previously a part of. And I am not an economist. I have not picked through all the data, but I think, yeah, it is quite easy to start. Like we said, this would happen for a while, that there would be these various things muddying the water. And I think, there were many things that was bad about COVID. But I think we said at the time, one thing from a purely academic point that was slightly frustrating was not being able to pick apart this data. But then if this kind of comparison, other countries who've also had to deal with COVID, and I mean, we were probably less locked down than quite a few of the G7, right? Especially when you compare us to, say, Japan, who have only really started to open up recently, and they're still doing quite well. So, we've already been open to tourism and all these other things that should have given us a boost, and still haven't managed to get things moving. So, yeah, I think it's, I think that's probably what I would point to if I was having an argument about that with someone. But yeah, no more points from me, I don't think, really. It's just, yeah, I mean, Liz Truss certainly didn't help, let's put it that way. But I don't think Rishi can blame it all on her. There may have been a simple writing of the ship, but I think anyone put in that position at the time could have pointed at what you needed to do to undo that spectacular flop in the economy we had when Liz Truss was in power. So, yeah, point 4. The NHS needs some investment. I mean, it's needed investment for a long time. I think the phrase generally bandied around is chronically underfunded. And obviously, we've just had COVID. You would think we'd want to give our nurses and doctors some more money after all of that. But yes, where are we with that?
Yeah, so again, this is one where he has said he wants to do it, and I think everybody would agree that it would be nice to give the NHS investment, and in particular sort of cut the COVID backlog that exists and reduce NHS waiting times. The problem is that when you look on the face of it, he's still having other problems with the NHS he has to deal with first. Most acutely, that's the issue of the nurses' strikes that have been continuing, along the... Yeah, they've been continuing. There was one in December. I think there was one early Feb. And the nurses essentially saying, we want Rishi Sunak to be involved in these talks. The government seems to be very reluctant to have any sort of pay talk with the nurses. So if you can't motivate or pay your workforce in that way, you are going to struggle to get them to cut NHS backlogs, in my opinion. And it's not a good look for him. I love the NHS. On one hand, I want to reduce its waiting list times, but also I'm kicking the nurses that helped the country through COVID that we clapped, but we're not willing to give more money to. So, yeah, bad look, bad vibes, something that, certainly hasn't been sorted in his 100 days. And again, I fail to see how he will be able to solve it by 2024.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a short timeline. That's next year, everyone. I guess if we do it on the 5-year term, it would be a December election, right? Because our last one was December 2019. So technically more than 12 months, but still a very short timeline to turn things around. You can't just win the lottery if you're a country, and fix all your debts, or in the NHS. So yeah, I mean, I think, as I said, chronic underinvestment. We can point you towards all sorts of things. Private Eye is generally quite good. They have a column in there, which is written by a doctor, and he talks a lot about the kind of issues going on with funding of the NHS and, stuff being sold off to private, like the slow move to stuff being privatized, and stuff, which is, as a lot of people say, look over to America. We don't want that. Maybe throw in the BDG video about medical insurance in the US, because he's currently freelance, working for himself, and had to go through all this stuff. And then at the start, he's like, look, this may not be very interesting to you, people in the UK, but watch out, because this is what's coming for you, kind of thing, which was quite a good point. And I think, yeah, the NHS is big and expensive, but compared to how much Americans pay to go and have their healthcare sorted, it's a drop in the water. So I think we should try and reinvest in the NHS and fix it. But I don't think the Tories are going to be the ones who do that for us, unfortunately. And I am slightly also worried about Labour, but that's not what we're talking about here today. So I guess I'm just going to be here to opine my opinions a bit on each of these points. So moving on to part 5, stopping small boats, which definitely doesn't fit with the others. And as I think we've already touched on, I mean, not that I'm saying everyone who's coming over as a refugee in a small boat is going to immediately start working and help the economy, but I very much feel like we've touched on the fact that immigration could be a good thing when you want to grow the economy. And so this one kind of seems a bit out of place amongst the other 5.
Yeah, I mean, he's focusing on the illegal channel crossings, as the Conservatives would call them. They're saying that it is people trafficking. It is a danger. They want to stop the illegal practice of small boats going on. And it's been a right-wing talking point for a long time. I think it was brought to attention of most people, even during COVID in 2020, was Nigel Farage would go out on a boat off the coast of Kent and say, look, there are people still coming over. This is a crisis. And eventually it's got to the front pages, and it seems to be a big talking point, particularly among the right wing of his party. So I think this is a deliberate attempt from him to try and get support from the more sort of Borisy side of the party, to say, hey, you might think I'm a wet centrist who wants to raise taxes, but I also want to kick those small boats as well. Remember, that's why you vote Conservative too. So I think out of all the 5 proposals he's got there, it's sort of the most achievable. He's put forward policies of like, okay, we'll work at the French at the Channel more to try and reduce it. I know Suella Braverman has says they'll have increased Royal Navy patrols in the area. However, the actual evidence that this is reducing small boats crossing is pretty low at the moment, and I believe that it was in a recent exchange with the Shadow Home Secretary, whose name is escaping me at the moment, but she's good, Yvette Cooper. Yeah, with the Shadow Secretary, Yvette Cooper, basically saying that, under the Conservative leadership, small boat crossings has increased, and you failed to do anything so far. So that's why he wants to get a handle on it, but there's sort of little proof that he's got anywhere with that, and it would require more legislation that he is yet to pass. So clearly not achieved in those first 100 days. And although he might be able to pass some legislation by the end of 2024, if it will be the vote winner that he thinks it is, able to get him across the line and make him more popular amongst the right of his party, personally, I don't think that is is enough. I think that wing of the party haven't forgiven him for, I'm doing air quotes now, you can't see me, stabbing Boris in the back, being one of the people who initialised that change, initialised the downfall of Boris, and essentially made him not be able to form a cabinet. So, yeah, he's batting on a very sticky wicket.
So, again, I don't have much to add to that particular point. I guess if we have all these things that he's been struggling to deal with, that he said he's going to deal with, you'd expect him to be focusing on those. What is he ignoring? What are the big problems? Like, I mean, anyone living in the UK right now is probably screaming at their podcast app of choice, because there's several big things we haven't touched on in dealing with these 5 points. So what have we not focused on? I guess, well, the obvious one is strikes are ongoing. Nothing seems to have been fixed with that since we last mentioned the strikes. So, where's that going? Have any of the strikes been called off and actually cleared up, or is it still strike city?
Well, not that I'm aware of. I know that there was a recent London bus strike that's been resolved, but I think that was sort of dealt with internally rather than in the government. You've got ones like the nurses don't look like they're going to stop striking anytime soon, and any chance of like pay being increased for them at the level they want seems very low. There are now strikes in education, like there was an entire teachers' strike in early Feb. That day on early Feb, we were almost getting to national strike limits, where the amount of services that were out on that day was incredible. And a recent report says that we've had the most day of strikes since under Thatcher's rule. So, they said Jeremy Corbyn was going to take us back to the 70s and 80s. Well, maybe it's the Rishi who's been able to take us back there, although these strikes were happening under Liz Truss as well, and they were the causes of these strikes were bubbling up even then. So yeah, that's a big thing he hasn't been able to get a handle on. All they've wanted to do really is try and pass legislation that says we'll stop people's ability to strike, which, hey, I guess that might reduce the strikes, but it doesn't solve any of the underlying problems that the country has and address the reason why people are striking. I guess he maybe is trying to address that, saying, I'll reduce inflation, therefore we won't need to pay you more because things will be affordable again. But I think for the moment, it's quite abstract and people want their money now so they can afford things now. They don't want to wait on a promise of maybe it'll get better in the future.
Yeah, and I think what we may have touched on this when we mentioned the strikes before, but, quite a few of these strikes are over pay disputes that are due in retrospect. So that, when this comes through, it's for last year's pay. And now, so they need to get that sorted before they can even start discussing the next pay increase that's due and should be affected by all of this inflation stuff going on. So it's like that there's, for some industries at least, that is the situation they're stuck in, where they're like, this is just the strike we need to resolve so we can get onto the next set of strikes, which is not a situation you ever want to be in, because you kind of want to be like, well, we can resolve this and it's over. But that's where quite a few of these problems are at the moment. And then, as you say, there were a few days where it felt like we were just, everything was on strike. But I think in general, people are behind them. I think it probably helps that there are more people working from home than there used to be. There are so many strikes going on that you need to resolve them. And quite a few of these are ones where the paymaster or the person who can control, like with the trains, those are private companies, but the person who has to get them around the table is the transport secretary. So these are things where the government can take a direct stance and fix things, and could if they wanted. And I think we touched on before that this is very Thatcher-like, holding the unions and trying to break the unions, but people are still striking. Like, I think they will probably not give up before the government, would be my call on it right now. So I think something that needs addressing, and worrying to me that it's not in the top list of priorities. I think that would definitely go above small boats on my priority list if I was making one. But yeah, so on to the next thing. Well, we mentioned Liz Truss in our joke at the start of the episode, so I guess, has Liz Truss done anything recently that might be a bit of a problem for Rishi Sunak?
Well, a problem kind of for him and maybe for the Conservative Party at large, but it's kind of an unwritten rule, I guess, that once you are a Prime Minister and you step aside, particularly for somebody within your own party, that you stay quiet for quite some time and let the other person rule and let them have their agenda. It has only been, as I said, 100 days of Rishi Sunak. If you're wondering why we didn't do 100 days looking at Liz Truss, that's because she only made it to 49. So she had time to implement one policy and it went belly up. but she's felt the need sort of around, but just after Rishi Sunak's 100 days, to come out with her own essay, which she published in the Daily Telegraph, which, to summarise, kind of said, yes, well, she didn't really apologise for what she got wrong, but she kind of said, look, my economic vision to go for growth was a true crusade, and that's what we really need to do. I just got it a bit wrong, but I didn't get it wrong. It was because the left-wing economic establishment stopped me. And although she never uses those words in the essay, that's what the Telegraph used as their headline. What she was getting at there was she believed that there were forces within Whitehall, so civil servants, people within the Treasury Department. One of the first things she did on her first day was sack the former leader of the Treasury Department so she could get her own economic policy through. And even sort of like within the Bank of England, forces that are keeping the British economy to keep taxes high rather than leave them low. That's kind of what she was saying. So she said that my policy was doomed to fail because people were unwilling to go far enough with it because they are too cautious in their economic thinking, which I think that when you go deeper into the article where she says, oh, I didn't know about this pensions crisis. I wish somebody had told me, or I wouldn't have put my economic policy into the live system when I did, if I thought it would cause this crash. It just seems very naive. And if anything, she's causing divisions within the Conservative Party, and she's reminding everybody that Liz Truss was a thing and was incompetent and was a Conservative who crashed the economy, which is not what Rishi Sunak wants at all. On top of that, you've also got the spectre of Boris Johnson, whereas Liz Truss, it looks like there's zero chance of her ever becoming Prime Minister again, there are a group of people within Parliament or within politics who feel that, hey, if they can unseat Rishi before the 2024 election, that's when Boris Johnson can sweep back in, get the bounce in the polls they need, and win in 2024 again, because Boris is the big election winner. Which, again, seems to me like madness. There were reasons that he couldn't stand in the, when he had that chance, when we thought it was going to be between him and Rishi Sunak for the leadership of the Conservative Party, and he'd have yet another internal election to decide that. He stepped to one side. It very clearly, to me, shows the internal divisions within the Conservative Party, that there is a Liz Truss wing, like a right-wing economic wing that exists. There is a populist wing that is the Boris Johnson party that wants him to lead the Conservatives, and there's the Rishi party in the middle that's a centre, and it's all sort of this odd coalition that isn't really functioning anymore and is chugging along, which means they can only really agree on some very basic Conservative principles, and that's it. Which is why I think these 5 principles that he's laid out are kind of so meh. There's nothing controversial. Like, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and Rishi Sunak would agree that you have to grow the economy. Guess what? Everybody in the country would agree that. Right? It's not a controversial policy to put in your manifesto. It's not interesting enough. That is why he is sort of hamstrung by what he can say, what he can achieve in these 100 days, just because the party simply isn't united enough. And these PMs speaking out when he's still Prime Minister certainly aren't helping one bit.
Yeah, I mean, when, again, not a massive amount of different opinion coming from me here, I'm afraid, but when I saw that Liz Truss was just like, oh, it's time for my comeback. And I'm like, I don't think you were really ever, you were technically in charge, but I don't think anyone ever thought that was a particularly good idea except for yourself. So, yeah, preparing for a comeback. And it's a bit like kind of the problem they have over in the US now, where they're like, who's going to run to be the Republican candidate? And will Trump come in and ruin everything for everyone? Kind of conversations that are going on. It's very much feeling like that, where you have, as you say, various factions that can't agree, and it's quite a big party. So those factors, it's not like there's 2 people following Boris Johnson around, his little, telling him, oh, you're great. There are quite a few people still who are like, Borisites. You've got your Rishyites and Lizites, I guess. And as we said, Rishi Sunak didn't win that first leadership election, so that means there's enough people supporting Liz Truss to get her through. Even if it was kind of let's try something a bit different, I guess, even though it's a bit like Boris, but with less economical understanding. But yeah, it's very weird at the moment for the Tory party. And I think that's another thing they'll struggle with going into a general election, is trying to put forwards a coherent message when you have essentially three quite big personalities still fighting over the core of the party. Speaking of factions in the Conservative Party, there's still a few kind of skeletons in the closet for Rishi Sunak as well. With we haven't really got over the sleaze, which, as we've pointed out before, was kind of the problem that was going on in the 90s under John Major as well. And yeah, we've still got Zahawi, we've got Dominic Raab. What's going on with all of that?
Yeah, so since in between our last podcast, we had like yet another Conservative Party scandal. Essentially, it was that the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nadim Zahawi, had not been paying all of his taxes as he should have, or hadn't declared it, and that is clearly very embarrassing for a government. It's embarrassing for any MP, but when they are literally the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the person who is in charge of money, that looks really bad. Now, he was only Chancellor of the Exchequer for the months where Boris Johnson was leader, but we were having the Conservative election. But still, that's a very bad look. And the way that Zahawi clung on, and even when he was pushed out the party, didn't really apologise, kind of said, well, I did nothing wrong. It was almost like a Trump defence of, well, I was being smart for not paying my taxes. I was just using the system that was available to me. It's not a good look, particularly within like a cost of living crisis or a time where you're trying to raise taxes or convince people that you have to pay your taxes in order to reduce government debt. Bad look for the party, looks sleazy, and even though Rishi Sunak said that he acted decisively, and I think this is one point where I can agree with him, he acted more than Boris Johnson would have, right? If Boris Johnson was in charge, Nadim Zahawi would still be Chancellor of the Exchequer, because Boris Johnson didn't sack anybody over their conduct, or the level you had to get to almost be sacked by Boris Johnson was so high it was unthinkable. Like that's the Chris Pincher affair that eventually brought him down, was him kind of saying, "Oh, we got to wait for the facts of this case to come out before I act on it." No, that's should have got rid of that person straight away. So yeah, Rishi Sunak did act faster than Boris Johnson, but it still reminds people that there are this problem of sleaze that seems sort of inherent in the Conservative Party at the moment. And on the back burner, you've also got Dominic Raab, the Deputy Prime Minister, who is still in position, who is facing increased allegations of bullying from people within his own party as well, and civil servants who have worked for him. The same kind of allegations that we saw levelled against Priti Patel, and even when that investigation came out and said that she was guilty of bullying, that was all brushed under the carpet and she didn't lose her job. So I wonder if Rishi Sunak will act on those things, and if he does, yes, he's better than Boris Johnson. However, it still shows that there are quite a few bad apples within the Conservative Party, and that once again undermines his message. He wants to be the one. He wants to be clean. He wants to be a fresh start. That's why you get a new leader in. You want to try and brush away the faults of your predecessor and say, no, these are the things they got wrong. I'm going to do it right. If these two more ministers going down with cases of sleaze shows that there is an inherent problem in the Conservative Party, that whoever's in charge, whoever they put underneath them, there's always going to be problems. That, again, is a big problem for Rishi Sunak in the 2024 general election.
Yeah. I mean, more of the same, really. Problems. And I feel like I'm going to keep referencing the 90s here because it does seem very similar. It's not times have changed. It's not Tory sex scandals where it turns out half of the Tory party were gay and keeping it hidden. But it is, it's another sleaze thing. I'm very glad that we've moved on as a society and no longer think that is considered sleaze and in the same way now, and that we're a more tolerant society, at least on that point. But yeah, it does feel like we're just drawing parallel after parallel here. One last point, I think, on things that Rishi hasn't really focused on. Well, I mean, I guess he technically did focus on his cabinet reshuffle. He had to put the thought in, and we kind of knew it would be coming. But what kind of issues has that thrown up? Because there's always that bit where suddenly someone gets thrust into the limelight, and we'll go, "Are they dodgy?" In the Conservative Party, the answer is probably yes. But in what way are they dodgy? So yes, what's going on with that cabinet reshuffle?
Yeah, so he did sort of a mini cabinet reshuffle which was forced by Nadim Zahawi having to step away. So he needed to employ somebody as the new head of the Conservative Party. That meant a few people changed roles. The most significant was that Lee Anderson became deputy party chairman. Now, if you don't know who Lee Anderson is, he's somebody who sort of has appeared on the fringes of Conservative politics. He's quite like, he's one of those red wall MPs. He's straight talking. His most famous policy, or most infamous policy, I guess, is that he straight up has said in an interview 2 weeks before he was appointed as deputy party chairman, yep, I believe in the death penalty. And for people who definitely did the crime, they should definitely have the death penalty, because if they're dead, they don't do no more crimes. Which is a point that you can raise, but in our society seems quite backward. And there is definitely a sort of branch of conservatives, a more caring conservatives, compassionate conservatives. You're thinking about sort of David Cameron's hugger hoodie type conservatives. They would be appalled by that idea and feel that it would be a vote loser. And so Rishi Sunak, by appointing somebody like Lee Anderson, is clearly trying to pull back some of those Boris voters, trying to get some of those Reform Party voters back to the Conservative Party, saying, hey, we've got one of your people in our party. That's why you can vote for us, because we're the party of this guy. However, that also works against you, because it reminds those compassionate Conservatives that you're giving those type of people ministerial power. And in particular, I've heard that there are rumblings, particularly within the Lib Dems, who are targeting key Lib Dem Conservative marginals, saying, yeah, we'll talk about Lee Anderson on people's doorsteps, saying, hey, is this Conservative said, these things about the death penalties? Is that this type of Conservative you want to be? We're not like that at all. Why don't you give the Lib Dems a try and send a message to them that you don't want these people in their party? It will be not only a vote winner, but a vote loser for him. And I think it shows once again that he has to have this uneasy coalition of people within his party, and his talent pool is drained now. Who has he got to pull from? Like, I'm not saying Nadine Dorries was a talent within the Boris Johnson administration, but she held a ministerial position for many years. She's resigned. She's saying that she's not going to stand next election. The former health secretary, Matt Hancock, has said he's not standing in the next election. Lots of Conservatives have had a look at the state of the party, don't think they're going to win in 2024, and have taken it as their opportunity to stand down. And that's going to cause more problems for Rishi Sunak. He has a diminished talent pool, nothing that he can really plan for the long run. And again, it kind of gives this impression that he is trying to keep the ship chugging on to 2024, but with not much light at the end of that tunnel.
Yeah, and I think that's a key point you've just touched on there at the end, where it was talking about people resigning, and it is a lot of people resigning, and people from all wings of the party, and they're going to have to, I'm sure that there are enough Conservatives that they can put up someone for every seat. It's not like they have to be worried about that. But, unless there are some real up-and-comers that we haven't heard about, and I think, as you say, at this point, we're kind of at the bottom of the barrel, is how it feels with this. There isn't anyone who we've heard of who are like, oh, they'd make a really good leader and would really help things out. So, yeah, I think it's the slow heat death of the Conservative Party, as I think we may have called it in a previous episode, or something similar. So yeah, I very much struggle to see how they could win a 2024 general election. Let's put it that way. Going to have to pull some magic hats or magic money trees out of hats. Yeah, something like that, because yeah, it doesn't seem like they're in a good position anymore. Which that's how things go in politics. That's what you would expect, is that we should be at this point due something other than the Conservatives again, having been there for 13 years at this point. Like, it's not surprising, but it's more trouble for Rishi Sunak. So with that kind of dreary outlook for the Conservative Party and Rishi Sunak's tenure as PM, do we wish to go into our general election predictor and the polls?
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to focus on the polls, because people did focus on them after 100 days. Most leaders, you would expect them to have some sort of bounce in the polls. It's the first 100 days. It's full of optimism. People are willing to give the new leader a chance. And to be frank, he couldn't do much worse than Liz Truss. So I'm really interested to see what the polls look like, to see how much of a bounce there has been.
So first things first, I mean, you said the bounce. I love how many of these posts I now get on Twitter through our Twitter account. at Unpile Podcast, in case you were wondering. But you Elect Politics UK posts like out polls with the raw numbers, which is quite fun to follow. Because nearly every time there's comments like, oh, look at that Sunak bounce whenever there's like plus 1% to the Conservative, which is very funny. Let's have a look at our general election predictor first, because that's the one that it's only updated once a month. So it was last updated at the end of January. So their current prediction is a Labour majority of 250, which, let me let you know, is a big number. The predicted seats there would be 450 for Labour, which would be more than double what they currently have. And the predicted seats for the Conservatives 112, which is, as I'm sure you can understand, a lot lower than they have now. Liberal Democrats would get a small increase. SNP would be about the same, which isn't surprising. Everyone else basically staying where they are. The probability of possible outcomes: Labour majority 96%, Labour minority 4%, which basically means it's not looking good for the Conservatives, as I think you'll agree. That's only calculated once a month. So let's go over to the polls proper. So our rolling average of the polls, currently a 12% lead for Labour on 48%, which isn't the highest they've been. Just before Sunak came in with Liz Truss, they did hit a high of 52% on an average of the polls. But still, 48%. There has been a slight bump for Sunak because Liz Truss was absolutely tanking things for the Conservatives. But since that kind of settled down, hasn't really changed that much. Labour still significantly in the lead. Conservatives on 26%. Lib Dems have dropped a little to 9%. And then Greens, Reform, SNP, etc. are all in their usual slots below that. So, yeah, I mean, anything you want to say about that, Rob? Or is that pretty much the picture you expected?
That's the picture I've expected. It's interesting to see. You can see like a very direct comparison between all three leaders there. Like Boris at his very lowest was probably about 31% when the scandals all came out and he had to resign in around about July of last year. So Labour were keeping about a 10% lead, but that's enough where Conservatives feel that they could peg it back, or maybe an election they can get some momentum behind them and, a couple of scandals in the Labour Party, maybe we can fudge a victory out of this. Then you get to Liz Truss and you see it dip all the way, like you say, down to 22% for the Conservatives and 52% to Labour. Then Rishi Sunak comes in and he's got them chugging on at 26%. So he's been able to recover about 4 to 5% of people who didn't like Liz Truss but are accepting of Rishi Sunak, but he's still 4 points behind where Boris Johnson was. So that's where we're at. That's the popularity of each leader. He is right in the middle when it comes to popularity amongst the general public. And that's a big problem for the Conservative Party. If you're not as popular as Boris Johnson was after everything that he did and how he was forced out, that's clearly an issue for you, and you've got a mountain to climb. Labour fairly steady at 48%, which is kind of what I expect. They haven't got... It's harder to go higher than 50%. You reach a ceiling eventually. And we've already pointed out that there's kind of a trouble for Labour maybe getting people to cross the aisle from Conservative to Labour to get their vote. Where we might see that happening a lot is up in that red wall. People who voted Conservative, who voted for Boris Johnson, thought they were getting one thing, got precisely the opposite and said, well, I might as well go back to Labour. They're promising these things. There was the values that I held and Boris Johnson let me down. So, yeah, very interesting. Not nervy for Labour at the moment. That's why I think you look at the polls and that's the reason why Labour are so confident, and that's the reason the Tories are struggling to get a grip on some of the key issues. They're just simply not. When you're polling at 25%, that means 3/4 of the country are pretty much against you, doesn't it? Which is a bad place to be when you're in power.
Exactly. And yeah, I mean, we've touched on it up to this point in this episode. I get the feeling it's not going to be good for the Conservatives, but there's always a chance Labour will absolutely stuff it up. So
yes.
Let's not count our chickens yet. But yes, I get the impression that's where things are going. Is there anything else you want to add? I don't have much to add. That seems like a reasonable analysis of the polls.
Yeah, no, that's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so thank you everyone for listening. As always, if you want to follow us anywhere, you can go find us on patreon.com/TTSS, where you'll get notified every time there's an episode. And there's also those Patreon bonus episodes we mentioned, starting from a mere $1 a month. You can throw any amount of money our way if you like, but $1 a month is all you need to get access to those. Then you can go find us on Facebook at unparliamentary language. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at unparlpodcast. You can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. And of course, there's nothing left for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.
Good evening and welcome to the bar. Join Dr. Wilko as he investigates the histories of your favourite spirits and your favourite cocktails while mixing you a drink at the bar. The other bars may be closed, but a podcast bar will always remain open.